This is Season 1 of the Constitutional Commons podcast. This season is called The Founders of the Constitution. Your host, Rob Natelson, is a nationally known constitutional scholar and author whose research into the history and legal meaning of the Constitution has been cited repeatedly at the U.S. Supreme Court by both parties and by individual justices. In this podcast, you will learn about the lives of leading founders and their unique contributions to the Constitution.
Hi, I'm Rob Natelson with the fourth installment in the Founders in the Constitution series. This one's about John Dickinson. Like James Madison, the subject of the last installment in this series, John Dickinson was one of those founders about whom it could be said, without him, we probably would not have a Constitution. However, Madison's contribution is justly renowned, while Dickinson's has been unfairly overlooked. Testifying to the proposition that Dickinson should get more credit was Forrest MacDonald, the eminent 20th century constitutional historian I mentioned in the previous essay. MacDonald ranked Dickinson as the most underrated of all the founders. MacDonald made that assessment in 1985, and when Dickinson's convention notes came to light 2 years later, they supported his assessment. In the first installment, I described the founding era political spectrum as ranging from unreconstructed Tories through high nationalists, moderate nationalists, centrists, conditional federalists, all the way to firm anti-federalists. Dickinson was a leading centrist. Many specific clauses in the Finnish Constitution reflected his ideas. It was his wisdom, moreover, that reminded the framers that in writing a constitution, they couldn't indulge their political fancies. Rather, they had to consider what had worked in the past and what the general public would accept. John Dickinson was born on November 8, 1732, so he was 9 months younger than George Washington. His first home was in Maryland, but the family soon moved to Kent County, Delaware, near Dover. You can visit the family homestead today. He was homeschooled. His education featured the typical heavy dose of Greco-Roman classics, and he retained a love for the classics all his life. As was true of Madison, John Adams, and Ben Franklin, he was not only a man of action, but also deeply intellectual. His writings are rich with references to thinkers profiled in my series on the ideas that form the Constitution. Series of thinkers like Aristotle, Polybius, Cicero, Tacitus, and John Locke. Dickinson decided he wanted to be a lawyer. So from 1750 to 1753, he clerked at a leading Philadelphia law firm, and then spent 4 years at the Middle Temple. The Middle Temple was, and still is, one of the 4 Inns of Court that train English barristers or trial lawyers. While in London, he composed a series of letters to his father describing life and study there. The letters show he was quick to recognize the talent of a young Scottish advocate named William Murray. Dickinson's youthful judgment was vindicated when Murray, later known as Lord Mansfield, became the greatest of all Britain's Chief Justices. When Dickinson returned to America in 1757, he entered law practice in Philadelphia. In the ensuing years, he split his public life between Delaware and Pennsylvania. Dickinson came from Quaker stock, and although he was not formally observant, he did follow Quaker views in liberating all his slaves. At the Constitutional Convention, he said it was, and I quote, inadmissible on every principle of honor and safety that the importation of slaves should be authorized to the states by the Constitution. Dickinson seems to have had a magnetic personality because people repeatedly entrusted him with political offices whether he sought them or not. Physically, he was unlike the short, stocky Adams and the diminutive Madison. He was tall and very lean. Like Madison, he suffered from fragile health, but through careful management, he enjoyed a comparatively long life. He died on February 14, 1808, at the age of 75. At age 26, Dickinson won a seat in the lower house of the Delaware legislature. In his second term, his colleagues chose him as Speaker of the lower house. But Philadelphia was where he was practicing law. And in 1762, he ran for the Pennsylvania legislature and was elected. While serving there, he carried on a celebrated battle over Pennsylvania's colonial charter, courageously opposing Benjamin Franklin's dominant state political faction. Dickinson lost the battle, but later events showed that he had been correct on the issue, while Franklin and his allies had been wrong. Dickinson's principal speech from the colonial charter controversy still survives. It's a remarkable performance. Quote, "A good man," he said, "a good man ought to serve his country, even though she resents his services." In 1765, he prepared the primary draft of the Pennsylvania Assembly's resolutions against the Stamp Act, and he also served in the Convention of Colonies known as the Stamp Act Congress. In 1767 and 68, he supported the colonial cause with a series of newspaper essays written under the title Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. The Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania were celebrated both throughout America and in Europe. When the author's identity became public, Dickinson became the second most famous American in the world after Benjamin Franklin. From 1774 until adoption of the Declaration of Independence, he served in the First and Second Continental Congresses, and he was the principal author of official congressional pronouncements. He also chaired the congressional committee that wrote the Articles of Confederation. The first draft of the Articles is in John Dickinson's handwriting. After opposing the Declaration of Independence as premature, he, along with fellow Pennsylvania Commissioner Robert Morris, withdrew from the final congressional vote so the tally for independence would be unanimous. Once independence was declared, he enlisted in the American Armed Forces. In 1779, however, Delaware sent him as its representative to the Continental Congress. 2 years later, the Delaware legislature elected him, or more accurately, drafted him to be state president, the equivalent of governor. The following year, while he was still the president of Delaware, the Pennsylvania Executive Council chose him in absentia to be president of their state. Dickinson served briefly in both offices before resigning from the Delaware presidency. He remained president of Pennsylvania for a 3-year term. By 1786, John Dickinson, like most Americans, recognized the need for a stronger government. Delaware sent him to the Annapolis Convention, where he was, of course, elected chairman. The Annapolis gathering recommended calling another interstate convention with wider powers. In response to this recommendation, the Virginia legislature called what became known as the Constitutional Convention. Delaware chose Dickinson as one of its commissioners or delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Although he was absent for several weeks due to illness, he remained in Philadelphia during this time, apparently supplying ideas and recommendations to his colleagues. Only 3 weeks into the convention, Dickinson prepared an outline for a proposed constitution. The outline built on Edmund Randolph's Virginia Plan, but it included many additional features the commissioners eventually adopted, including enumerated powers, selection of senators by the state legislatures, a minimum age of 30 for senators, rotating elections, restrictions on the states issuing money, guarantees of trial by jury and habeas corpus, and the embryo of what became the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Naturally, his plan also included some ideas not ultimately adopted, such as an executive branch headed by 3 persons instead of 1. One of John Dickinson's most important constitutional contributions was his role in developing the concept later known as dual sovereignty, by which the central government would have sovereignty as to enumerated or listed subjects, and the state would be sovereign as to all other matters. Dickinson thought the state should be equally represented in the Senate, and he envisioned states actively checking the federal government, a process that James Madison later denoted as interposition. In an essay I wrote earlier for the Independence Institute and for the Epoch Times, I quoted Dickinson's convention speech in which he compared the prospective federal system to the balance between the sun and the planets in the solar system. More typically, though, Dickinson resorted to history, tradition, and prudence. In some ways, his thought anticipated the later writings of the famous British parliamentarian Edmund Burke, who was known as the father of modern conservatism. A good illustration is Dickinson's August 13, 1787 convention floor speech. In the Anglo-American tradition, only a legislature's lower house could initiate bills imposing taxes. The upper house had to either agree or disagree to what the lower house had initiated. Some of the convention's participants argued for abandoning that tradition. Here is Dickinson's response as reported in Madison's convention notes. Experience must be our only guide. Reason may mislead us. It was not reason that discovered the singular and admirable mechanism of the English Constitution. It was not reason that discovered or ever could have discovered the odd and, in the eye of those who are governed by reason, the absurd mode of trial by jury. Accidents probably produced these discoveries, and experience has given a sanction to them. And has not experience verified the utility of restraining money bills to the immediate representatives of the people? Shall we oppose to this long experience, the short experience of 11 years, that is from 1776 to 1787, the experience of only 11 years which we've had ourselves on the subject? All the prejudices of the people would be offended by refusing this exclusive privilege to the House of Representatives. And those prejudices never should be disregarded by us when no essential purpose is to be served. When this Constitution goes forth, it will be attacked by the popular leaders. Aristocracy will be the watchword, the shibboleth among its adversaries. 8 states have inserted in their Constitution the exclusive right of originating money bills in favor of the popular branch of the legislature. Most of them, however, allow the other branch to amend. This it would be proper for us to do. Assisted by Edmund Randolph, Dickinson won this argument. The result was the Origination Clause, Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1, which provides that only the House of Representatives can initiate new taxes. During the ratification debates, the Origination Clause proved to be a lifesaver. Just as Dickinson predicted, opponents assailed the Constitution as being too aristocratic. If the Origination Clause had not been available to rebut that charge, the document may never have been ratified. Still contending with ill health, Dickinson left the convention shortly before the Constitution was signed. He deputized his Delaware colleague, George Read, to sign for him. Dickinson's 2 home states, Delaware and Pennsylvania, became the first and the second states to ratify the Constitution. When the pace of ratification slowed, Dickinson once more took up his famous pen and composed a series of essays supporting the document. The pseudonym or pen name he chose was Fabius, the famous Roman general whose guerrilla tactics kept Hannibal at bay. The Fabius essays were distributed nationwide. Like Madison, John Dickinson played crucial roles at several stages of Constitution making. creating background institutions such as the Articles of Confederation, drafting the Constitution itself, and promoting ratification. Far more than Madison, however, Dickinson impressed his specific ideas into the text of the Constitution. You can find more information about this in my longer scholarly article called The Constitutional Contributions of John Dickinson, available from a link on the Independence Institute website. I'm Rob Natelson, and thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the series, The Founders of the Constitution. To make sure you never miss an episode, be sure to like this in your podcast app and subscribe to be notified every time a new episode is released. For more information about the U.S. Constitution and this series, head over to thinkfreedom.org. Thanks for listening.